the first part of the tutorial, we'll be setting up the skin geometry to use in our groom. So the first thing to do would be to drop a file, just in a standard file swap, and grab the rest geometry. Now this is the base model for the geometry. This can be the non-animated or a rest position that you can use in a scene. Personally, I prefer to use an actual geo off to the side, as we will also be bringing our animated geometry in the same file. I prefer to keep them in one file for working purposes. This allows for a single location for referencing either animated or rest skin geometry. So we're just going to call in the alembic, which is this one here. And as we can see, when we bring in the alembic, it is a packed alembic. So the first step here would be to unpack the alembic so that we can work with the geometry. As we can see, the model that we're using is pretty low poly, so we are going to handle that and do a isolate on the body first. We're going to just run a quick delete where we isolate the body geometry. Just do a non-selected, and this isolates the body from the claws, eyes, and I'm assuming teeth. Yes. We are going to run the same process on the alembic or the animated skin. As we can see, the naming conventions for the groups on the animated mesh are not present. This is sometimes a problem that you may run into in a pipeline scenario. So what we will be doing is we will be saying delete selected, delete the delete, grab the skin, and just run a simple blast. This will help us isolate the skin geometry. Now, in a situation like this, it is often best to shoot whoever made the model a message and just apply the same kind of grouping structure to remain consistent throughout the pipeline. But working around that, we are going to run a subdivide to give us a bit more resolution for our mesh. This will allow us to paint more highly detailed attribute masks for driving various elements of the groom. We are going to do the same level of subdivision on the animated mesh, and then we are also going to run a retime. As we can see in this situation, we have a animated mesh with a variety of animations on it. But what we are going to do is we are going to isolate the animation to a single cycle, the walk cycle here in the beginning. We can see that the cycle runs up to about 19 frames. So we are simply going to hook up the retime, and we are going to shift by frame. We are going to select that as the input frame, and then frame 19 as the final frame, pre-cycle and post-cycle. This allows us to run the walk cycle in a loop. Having this, we have a higher detailed mesh for our rest and our animated skin. But as we can see, the next problem is scale. This model was imported from Maya, and the usual scale difference for Maya and Houdini is about 0.01. So we are going to run a transform to just drop the scale down to 0.01. Now, a quick little trick that you can use to just check that your model is in Houdini scale is to use one of the test geometries. I prefer to use Tommy, as he is an average human size, and we can see that the scale of the cat is in proportion with that. Now, bringing over the transform, we get a correct scaling on our animated mesh, and we can see that we are now ready to proceed to the next step. This basically shows where we will be handling the attributes inside of this sub here. So we are just going to name it skin. With the next step, we will be looking at the topology. One of the problems that may arise due to our manipulation of the topology is non-matching point number, which would be a problem further down in the groom when it comes to deforming a groom to a animated mesh. So a quick simple solution for this would be a match topology node, which will allow us to grab the geometry point order with the correct point order, which would be from our static or rest mesh, and then the geometry with the scrambled point order. I prefer to keep the animated mesh as the scrambled point order, as this is likely to change. So looking at this, we'll see that now this has taken care of the point numbers so that they match. We can use this join here as a point of reference, where we can see that 1136 and 1136 are the same. Now, this may not be a problem here initially, but this may be a problem down the line. This is just an added layer of defense to ensure that the groom stays working as we progress through the pipeline, and any updates to the animation or the geometry will not affect the groom in any way. Going on, we're just going to put down two nulls with out to signify that these are the points of reference for our other operations. So this one will be the rest skin. Fantastic. Now moving on, we've got the first part of the guide groom. We will be dropping a guide groom node, and we will be assigning the rest skin as the sub path for our groom. Now, the first thing that the guide groom does is it scatters guides all over the geometry, and this is not something that we want. Obviously, we will want to control this with a skin attribute. So in the guide groom node, just as a little bit of introduction to this, this is Houdini's first step in a grooming pipeline. First part of its toolset. In Houdini19, there's been a number of changes to the grooming tools, which we will go through in depth in this tutorial, but the guide groom node is always the first building block in that puzzle. So looking at this, we've got a source mode, which we can use either a groom object or a groom file. This is very useful for bringing in grooms after a mesh has gone through major updates or changes, whether that changes topology flow or the general scaling or size of proportions or anything in that line. This will be a method that you can use to transfer a previously done groom onto a new geometry without really impacting the workflow in any way. Our next is the skin source. You can either use a file or a soft geometry. The soft geometry is what we'll be using in this case, where we can see that it is a rest skin, which we created here. The next part will be the voxel size. We are going to adjust that momentarily so that we can ensure that the VDB is at the correct resolution to support the groom that we'll be doing. Next up is the guide creation. This shows basically what method of scattering or guide creation will be done. Scatter on surface simply scatters a number of points onto the surface of the geometry. The guide per point is the method where it generates a guide per single vertex or single point on the geometry, and then using external geometry is what allows us to bring another groom in at this level and convert it. You can use other curves as long as they are close enough to the geometry. You can draw curves on it by hand, and you can then snap the root to the skin. This is a very useful way to bring in quick little pieces of a groom or any parts that you need to add at a later stage, such as braids or any form of bun or external structure, which requires a bit more, how do we put this, a bit more structure to its operations. So next we have the density control for the groom, the scatter seed, which just randomizes the scatter. It's just a simple seed. The relax iterations, which makes the scattering more uniform. And then the fur direction. This is an attribute that can be created to dictate the direction in which the guides are spread. By default, it is set up as you bring in the guide groom node. Segments is the resolution of each guide. As we can see here, if we increase this, it will increase the resolution of the guide. Now, it is my own practice to use a value of around 12, but you should feel out which feels better to you as you work through your own grooms. This basically impacts the ability to get finer control of shapes, just more resolution when it comes to sculpting the actual groom itself, or when you do simulations, the resolution in the simulation that you'll be able to achieve. For hair and fur for animals, it's usually not that impactful unless it's something really long like a lion's mane or a horse's mane. But for humanoid hairstyles, it's quite important. Length is a length control for the guides, pretty self-explanatory. And then you can also adjust a display color for your guides to distinguish should you have more than one guide groom node. The default being red, which I do quite like. You can also bypass the editable subnetwork, which basically allows you to use your own various sub-functions inside and around, and just it's a bit more of an advanced feature which we won't really go into. And then your skin attribute transfers basically transfers various attributes from skin to your groom and allows it to carry through the chain. So the first step we'll be taking is to double check the voxel size, unlocking the guide groom by right-clicking and say allow editing of contents. You will be able to go inside and view from the top of the chain. We find the VDB from polygons. Viewing this node, we can see that the VDB is a bit too low resolution for our purposes. We're just going to then, while having that viewed, go back up to our top level and adjust from here 0.05 in an increment of halves to 5, and we will drop down to 1. That is a bit better. As we can see here, the actual form of the geometry is now followed. I do prefer a bit of a higher resolution, but this is up to your own personal preference. Yes, there we go. That does fit a bit better. The next thing to do would be to go back in, select our display so that we can see our output, and we'll see now that the guides do form a bit better to the surface of the geometry. So the next step being the problem of the guides scattering everywhere. As we can see, they are inside eye holes, probably inside the mesh in the mouth bag, and inside cavities. Now this is a bit of a problem, as this is not where we really want the guide creation to happen. So we are quickly going to adjust that by painting our first attribute mask. Houdini has got a wonderful system in their guide grooms where you can simply select here density and apply a skin override. This creates a density attribute where we can simply click this icon here to drop a density paint here. This will create a attribute create node and a attribute paint node. So this here just creates a density float, which is editable here in the mask. As you can see, the geometry comes in with a full value of 1, which is fine, but let's quickly go over the paint node in Houdini if you have not yet used it. Going over this, we'll see that the basic first tab is the brush settings. It simply dictates your left mouse operation, middle mouse operation, and the paint mode is add, over, maximum, minimum. These are pretty self-explanatory if you've used any other painting program. Over simply replace, add simply adds it to the current float value that is present on the mesh, adds a maximum value, a minimum value, and multiplies it with the current value on the mesh. Our foreground float color would be 1, which is what it currently is. Our background coat color would be a 0, which is done by holding control. If you hold control, you can switch to your background, which is 0. And then the radius of your brush can be controlled here or with the middle mouse wheel. The opacity changes the level of the brush, the opacity level of the brush, which basically means that at 0.5 this will be a 0.5 value of the foreground float, and at maximum we will drop down to 0, indicated by the blue. We then have the soft edge, which increasing allows you to increase the softness of the edge or decrease it to be very hard. Simply revert that back to defaults, and then select our brush, fill it with 1, and then using the shape we can switch to volume, which is a volume size brush. As you can see, it has 3 dimensions. The surface brush has just 1 dimension where it sticks to the surface. This is especially useful with thinner geometry like the ears up here. If we were to remove the inside, you'll see that the back stays unaffected. However, if we were to use the volume brush and remove, you'll see that the volume carries through to the back of the ear. However, the volume brush is very useful when it comes to larger areas like the inside of the geometry, such as the mouth bag, where you will be able to knock out larger swaths of it. I prefer each brush for different uses, but that is up to you to determine as you go through. Next up is the fill, which you saw me use, which simply fills the geometry with a specific value, whether it is 1 or 0, and then the nearest point, which is the most accurate form. It simply replaces the point value nearest to your cursor with the value that you desire. At this point we have the blue mesh where it is 0, and the red just is replaced as such as a 1 value to the nearest point to my cursor. We will, however, quickly be painting a quick attribute mask just to dictate the density that we want the guides to scatter. Using the volume brush, we are quickly going to remove a few areas that don't have fur growing on them, such as the nose here. Using control and left clicking, we can paint a mask. Now you'll note that I'm only painting one side of the mask, as we need to enable symmetry, and this will allow us to paint both sides. So using this technique, we can quickly clean up the rest of the mesh. Just add the elements that we require. Now the density mask is a mask that is very useful in various elements of the groom, as we'll be using it for multiple purposes, as it is a dual impact mask. We can use this to drive influence radius. We can use this to drive thickness, hair thickness, if you wanted to blend hairs going thinner as they go to areas where there are no hair. We can use this to drive various shading attributes on the hair shader. We can use this to drive simulation attributes. We can drive anything using masks, really. So I'm quickly going to time-lapse the rest of the painting of this, then you can see what the end result is. Here we have the final product of the density mask, and by using masks we are keeping the process procedural. You could in essence go into your guide room and physically remove the guides, but using masks has many advantages when it comes to keeping the pipeline fluid, as this is tied to the geometry and the geometry is non-changing. The guides will always have their impact regardless of whether or not the mesh tends to change, or whether you need to affect a guide in a different way or use a different groom, or if you have multiple grooms on the same mesh. Say now you needed to for example have a long-haired version of this cat or a short-haired version of this cat. So as we can see here now, the geometry, we bring the density up by another factor of 10. It's pretty dense, but just to demonstrate a point, we can see here that the guides are not scattering on the nose or in the eye cavity or inside of the mouth bag. It looks like we did miss a little spot there with our mask painting, but we can quickly go and fix that up. As we can see here, the blend that I did inside of the ear to slowly decrease the density going outwards is affected here by less of a scatter. Now at this point in the groom, I would recommend bringing up some reference for the kind of fur that you're looking to create. In this situation, I'm thinking we're going to go with a long-haired tabby cat. I've already prepared some reference which I will bring up on screen. As you can see, we've got our references now here on the side of the screen. You can use a number of programs to do this kind of thing, PureRef, Quadro, or another on-screen reference program. I like to just keep them here on the left of the screen so that I can always see the reference as I'm busy grooming. Before we continue, I'm quickly going to jump away into the analysis segment of this tutorial, where we're just quickly going to look at these references in Photoshop, for example, and just break down the various elements which we will be looking at and needing to keep in mind as we go forward into the groom. When I approach a groom for the first time, I tend to do a little bit of an analysis of some reference just to see what kind of thing, what kind of elements I should be keeping an eye on, and also just to keep an eye rooted in reality. So the first thing I like to do usually is just look at the general structure of a groom and see what kind of groupings we can break apart there. This will help determine what kind of areas are actually in a groom, such as for this cat here, we can see that various areas such as the mane, around the face, around the hind legs and the tail, the underside of the belly, and the paws are all distinctly different in their texture, their feel, and the way the hair actually falls and lays out of each other. So if we were to enable this, you could see in this overlay a rough layout of the type of groups that one could expect when going forward in terms of a groom. So here we can see that the tail, for example, is a group in and of itself, which here has less of a hard clump, as one would say for the neck here, or for the general level of frizziness or noise in the actual strands. We can see that this is a lot more wispy, whereas this is a lot more controlled in its clumping. Looking at the neckline here, we can see there's some parting division lines and some more tighter clumps down here with a little bit of curling in them. Looking at the head, we can see the type of lengths, and at the ears, we can see that they come out and there's not a full density in there. It's a bit more of a lighter density with a bit more of a directed clumping. Next thing I like to determine is the flow of the hair. The crucial part of anything is the flow, as this is what directly informs the next step of the grooming process and how we actually place our guides and where they go. You'll see that the flow of hair in many animals, or people for that matter, whether that is hairstyles or hair and fur on a creature, actually has a significant impact on the realism attributed to the hair and fur groom. So for example, you'll see that if we were to do a quick overlay on this, where you actually determine the flow, you'll see that the overall body flow comes from the nose, up over the head, down the chin, and then pointing forward, down, and then down to the back where it comes to the legs. Now there are a bit more intricate areas. If we were to look at the very serious image down here, we'll see that there are hard cut-off lines, points where the fur actually merges up into ridges and peaks and actually frays away from each other, leaving opening areas. Switching back on the flow, we can see that it goes up, goes down, out through the nose, along the cheeks, under the eyes, away from the eyes, and up over the brows. This kind of flow analysis is quite important when it comes to distinguishing the patterns that you will be laying out when it comes to actually laying out your guides, and a good understanding of this is I think a crucial aspect to doing a very realistic groom. Back in Houdini now, we're just quickly going to talk about the next phase. If you remember, we unlocked the guide groom initially, and that left us with the ability to access the more internal workings of the node. But if you go back in and match the current definition of the node, you will see that when you go inside, you are greeted with the standard node flow, I like to call it, of a Houdini groom node. You'll notice that this kind of operation is common when we address the guide deform and the guide simulate later on in the process. This kind of workflow is pretty consistent throughout. So looking at our skin, the first thing I usually like to do is set up my scene so that it is a bit easier to see the guides. First thing we're going to do is we're going to lower the density, as that was just a check. We can lower it quite heavily, as we'll be drawing most of the guides ourselves. This is just to get a good amount of scatter on it and just get our initial directions. I tend to remove most of the guides, as my first order of business is to start with the face and then work my way backwards and just lay out the guides manually, as I find that is a bit more of a control process, doing it right the first time. So a couple little tricks just to make the guides a bit easier to see is if you press D in the viewport, you will bring up the display options for your Houdini scene. I like to set the background to dark. This allows the guides to stand out a little bit more in the eye, and it's just a bit more gentle on the eye when viewing your groom and actually working in the scene. The next thing you can do is you can go to geometry, as the guide curves are a bit thin. You can go to geometry, wireframe, wire width, and you can actually adjust their thickness size. This is just making the guides a little bit easier to see and to work with. The next thing I like to do is, especially with dense grooms, is to switch off display as subdivision curves. This basically speeds up the viewport and increases a bit more performance, and you can then see the exact resolution of the sculpt that you are working with. So to begin our grooming process, we are going to drop our first node, and as you see, when I went in there, now the skin disappeared. You can adjust that here at the top by just saying show all objects. This shows all the objects that we have got a display flag on, and allows us to see the skin as we are grooming. We drop a guide groom node here. We will see that we are given one of these, and in the Houdini hair and fur workspace, you'll see that if I drag it into the middle of the chain here, it grabs all the inputs and places them where they need to be. The inputs being the guides, the skin, and the skin VDB. We also have access to a fourth input here, the guide groom node being one of the features that was heavily changed in Houdini19 to be a lot more user-friendly and work a bit better with a whole bunch of new features. So upon first opening the dropping the guide groom, you will be greeted with these basic properties. We'll go through them quickly just to do a general introduction to this node, as this is one of the nodes that you'll be using quite regularly in the grooming process. I would actually say that this is the primary node used in the grooming process. So looking at the options, it can be quite overwhelming, as there are a number of options available to you to use as grooming tools. You can first see here that we have a group, and then a group type, which is points, images, primitives, breakpoints, your standard. Then the tool that you'll be using, as this is a toolkit. I like to think of it as just the tool bag for the grooming artist. So this is where you will be accessing your various tools, going through them quickly. The first tool being draw. What this does is basically allow you to select the mesh and simply draw out a guide, which is pretty cool. If you go into brush options, there are various modifiers that you can attribute to this tool, such as your curve type being a parting line, which allows you to draw a parting line on the surface of the geometry, as you can see there, that is sticking to the VDB which we created earlier. If we go to guide, it will draw out the guide as before. And then segment mode being adaptive. If I switch on our points here, you will see that if I draw this out, it will adapt the number of segments by length. You can adjust that here. So now it will be a lot longer. And if I bring it down quite low, it will be a lot shorter. I'll just bring it down a little bit lower to show you. As you can see there. Control Z up our way there, and then fixed. If I draw on the skin, it will stick the guide to the skin. Very useful if you were doing say horse manes. It would allow you to very rapidly get the look that you are wanting to go for. Next would be the plant node, the plant tool, sorry. The plant tool is got a number of features. One of my personal favorites is a new addition. In previous versions of Houdini, your ability was to plant single guides, and this was how we did it for a very long time. Now it gives you the ability to scatter multiple guides in a brush style. So upping the density will allow you to scatter multiple guides across the surface of a geometry, and those guides interpolate between previously placed guides. So we will get to that at a later point. I will show you how that works. But you've got your average brush settings, softness, object radius, which is your brush size, screen radius, which is also the brush size for a different kind of brush, which is the brush radius in pixels when the surface brush is turned off, and then your object radius, which is the brush in Houdini units in terms of its screen space, then your softness of the brush, which is your fall off. You can make it low to be hard or high to be a lot softer along the edges. Your spacing, which is the spacing between the guides. It's a mix between density. I tend to keep these just at their default values, as they tend to work best. Lowering the density. We also have a default length at which you would like to drop them, and then I'm just going to drop a number of guides here on the surface just for our own testing purposes moving down the chain. The delete is a simple remove. The cull is a degenerate, which removes a number of these guides based on a density. I like to think of it as the opposite of the plant scatter. So you'll see that it starts to degenerate the number of guides that are there to a density limit, which is here. Then we have the cut, which is a brush similar to the delete, but removes segments of a guide. As you can see, we can slice away, and we can also completely remove guides. Next up is the brush, which is a bit strange in Houdini19 as it tends to be a bit heavy-handed. It seems to have been separated from the sculpt tool, which is the next one, which I prefer to use, as this gives you a bit more control over guides. As you can see, will allow you to actually move guides around and sculpt them as you would in any other 3D sculpting program. Next would be your sculpt with physics. Now this is a new feature in Houdini19 again, where it's got a vellum node baked into it, and I can actually sculpt elements of the groom while a vellum simulation runs in the background. Going back to sculpt, you can see that the changes are still left there. Straighten is basically the node which just forces the guides to straighten. Lift lifts the guides from the surface of the geometry. If you adjust the length, you can actually adjust the length of the geometry. Using adjust length, it is possible to adjust the length of the guides, whether that is either lengthening or shortening. You can use the parameters under the brush options to adjust the modifiers to that, strength being the strength of the effect of growing or shortening. As you can see here, it happens pretty quick in one click, but if I were to make that fractionally less, it happens a lot slower. You can also adjust the value to have it decrease or increase in length based on your scale. You can change your mode from add and subtract to set, which will use the value to set a standard length. And your scale, cut and extend, just two different methods of using the tool. The next tool is the smooth tool. As we can see here, some of these are a bit jagged. Using the smooth tool, you can just smooth out the values. It simply averages the vector across the curve to get a smoother curve. Your move tool is another cool one. This one allows you to move the root position of your guides on the surface of a mesh. This is very useful for fine-tuning your groom near the end or during your polishing phase to really get specific contours going. Your relax is essentially the direct way to affect the scattered position of your guides. It simply relaxes the point distance and attempts to average out the distance between the root position of the guides. Your clump will clump various guides together. I believe it's pretty self-explanatory, as you can see. Using this, you can generate clumped guides. I tend to prefer to do this on a node-based level and not actually at a guide level either, but in some situations it is quite useful if you wanted to make, for example, a ponytail position or like a root position for a braid or something like that. There's also the next one, which is the blur. This simply averages out the guides between the guides around it, hence it interpolates a guide position between two guides and tries to average out the guides between that. The rest of the tools down at the bottom are various new utilities that they've added to Houdini. Your de-intersect tool, your paint mask tool, which is just the painting of various attributes onto the curves, paint groupings, transform handle, resample utility to resample your guides, a twist utility to twist the normals or vectors along the curve, and then the mirror utility, which will mirror guides across. Preview, apply. Mirroring, enable the mirror, and this will allow you to mirror a guide grouping across. Now that we've covered all the basic tools that we'll be using, we'll start with the actual grooming process. Right now I've got a fresh geometry. I've removed all of the guides from the mesh, and we are going to start drawing on our guides from the beginning. So with our reference here on the side, we can see the flows that we need to make, and I'm going to start with the face of the cat. I prefer to use the draw tool in the beginning, as it's just a little bit easier to get the exact flow that you want. You can also use the plant tool to plant a single guide, and then a sculpt to sculpt that into place. This was the preferred method in Houdini 18.5 for myself. This was the way I would do things, but in Houdini19 I've actually found that it's a little bit easier to use the draw tool, as it's a bit of a more streamlined process. While having our mirror on, I'm just going to start laying out a few guides. As you can see, it's quite easy to just drop a few. So I would keep it pretty sparse in terms of density for now, starting with your big flow directions. So I would pepper across the entire surface of the area in which I'm working the guides that would dictate the flow for the rest of the guides. That way we can switch to a plant scatter, where we can put multiple guides in at a controlled way. So we'll start here with a forward nose direction, just 3 there. So we can see the hair goes forward there. And then our turning point is here. So we'll do a groom from around the eye, coming up, just to understand our flow. And the guides come out and across in this way. Then we switch to a sculpt, and then another draw. So this is a pretty basic process where you just start laying out the foundation of your guides. For the sake of interest, I will be limiting the commentary on this, as it is a pretty straightforward process, just monitoring the general directions. So I'll be throwing this next section into a time lapse where we can see the exact process, and I'll jump in and comment as we need to as soon as we get to more technical sections. You'll see that now we've got a basic flow for the face. We've got most of our guides in position. The basic starting guides, just to give us something rough to start working with. A few good tools at this point will be the smooth tool, which just gets rid of a few of the kinks in the groom. We can then keep working on just adjusting various parts of the groom using our sculpt and our smooth. But at this point, it's a good time to start working with a bit of a scatter. A lot of other workflows that you'll perhaps see take a little bit longer to get to a point where we can actually find a lot of the visual progress in the groom actually occurs at the guide based level. My preferred workflow is to do a lot more of the grooming work in the actual point of the pipeline where we generate the hairs. That's where I prefer to do a lot more of my clumping and my feel and my actual grooming work in the hair gen based level. But at this point we're pretty much just looking for flow and length, so the important thing would be the actual length of the guides, but that's very easy to adjust in a post-process kind of way. I think in the beginning the important thing to do would just be to start feeling the forms. I like to go around the mesh and just start looking at the silhouette that the hair would be creating, especially for the longer segments like the chest or around the mane. That's a very important thing to just keep in mind if we were to compare those two images here and here. You'll see that we'll be doing a lot of like influence on the actual silhouette of the character, and that is an important part that hair can play in terms of a character's identity or just in how they feel. To get that silhouette right is quite important. But now that we have this good density going here, we're going to jump to a plant, and we're going to change this to a scatter. And initially the scatter is pretty low, so you have to tune up the density quite high. But as you can see, just bringing the scatter through the mesh, we'll see that the brush just scatters a wonderful density of curves for us. I do prefer to keep a good density of curves, as I find it's just a bit easier when it comes into general grooming, simulation, most aspects of the groom in fact, and especially for very short hair or areas where there are a lot of detail in the groom. I find it's quite important to have a higher density of guides. For areas like the belly here or something that's a large swath of very uniform hair, you can have a bit more of a sparse population of guides. But when it comes to something like the ears or areas where there are distinctive parting lines, I find it's often easier to just throw some more control and resolution on your groom by having more guides present. So we're just going to continue to increase the density and just slowly bring up the count of the guides that we have around the facial area. Being very careful not to drop guides where we don't want them. Slowly increasing the density more. So the slider here is quite exponential, so as I go up it's starting to go up quite a lot. You'll see there are areas like that which are quite strange in their clustering. Bring the scatter up quite high. And then on the chin, now you can obviously adjust this past its initial point, but what I prefer to do is just switch to a single scatter for these tricky areas and just drop a few chains like so. Not worrying too much about the exact placement of our guides at this point, because I find it's just a bit easier to place now and then clean up as we go. But as you can see, we're already starting to get the feel and the form and the shape right. Switching back to the sculpt, we're just going to start cleaning up a few of the areas, like the section here, the area around the eyebrows. And the sculpt tool is something that you do get used to. It is a bit of an interesting process to actually get a feel for, but it is something that you will catch on. The more you use it, the better you'll become at it. You'll begin to understand the nuances of actually using the tool. There are certain methods that you can use to get the desired results that you want. So we're going to deal with these little strange clusters quickly. What you can do is you can use a cull to actually bring down some of the guides in certain areas where they appear to be a touch too dense, such as here on the cheek. Just tapping it down, just removing some of the guides. The chin area as well, just giving that a bit less of a guide, and then cleaning up some of the spots that we need to. And then I like to put in a few with the plant again. We'll just drop a few strategic guides just to keep our influence up in areas where there's less guides. Especially areas like this where you've got a distinctive what we would call parting line. Me personally, I don't actually use parting lines. I prefer to keep it more natural. That way we get the specific flow. I do also enjoy the little bit of crossplay that comes between the actual divisions, as long as you keep your actual guides flow in that channel there and crawl them quite close to each other. You should be fine. There are obvious advantages to parting lines, don't get me wrong, but I do find often or not that they are more trouble than they're worth. And just in my own personal opinion, if you do choose to use them, that is up to you. But right there, we've got a pretty good collection of guides. Now, one of the cool things you can do is you can, by pressing S on your keyboard, you switch to a selection mode. I like to use a brush select and then just select the curves which I want to affect. And then if you select your tool that you would like to use, in this case we want to use a move, and then simply hit enter, it'll assign the primitives which you have selected into your grouping. That way, while your symmetry function is still on your mirror, you can simply move the guides into position, and this way we're actually getting that closer seam for a more distinguished parting line. This is also quite heavily affected by the influence radius of the actual curves that you'll be, the hairs that you'll be generating. So when I talk about influence radius, I'm talking about the area around the actual guide. This is the influence that it has on the actual hairs generated around it. So if there were, for example, if we look at these two, there are 4 hairs generated between these. The influence radius would be, if it's quite small, would be here around this, and then that would essentially say would generate 2 hairs out, and this 2 hairs out, and then the overlap is interpolated between the two. Moving on from that little section, we will start looking at the nose in more detail, just planting a few missing guides here. We'll see that this is an interesting convergence point on the nose of the cat. So in this situation, what we'll be using is the smooth function just a little bit, just to, first things first is to clear your grouping. Do not press clear here. This clears the strokes of the brush and of the actual guide group node, and will remove all of the strokes that you have done thus far. But using the smooth, we'll just quickly adjust a few of these areas, and then we'll select a blur to just blend the areas together just a little bit more. Alright, fantastic. As you can see, it smooths out the general interpolation between the guides. And leaning on that interpolation, the actual flow, and when you get to areas like this, what you'll be relying on is the fact that the hairs that are generated from these guides are actually interpolated between them, so you will get a very natural kind of fall off and flow between the guides, as long as they're not too different. But in often cases, you can utilize that to your benefit to achieve a desired look. As I'm going, I'm just adding a few more little supporting guides, and you'll see these two here. We're just gonna brush them up and then brush these two down, just to give that this little crown, if you will, a little bit more of a bit of flow. See areas like this, smooth out quite a lot, and there you go. So for areas where the guides actually end, and we would see skin, for example, the nose here, whether I like to think of these as hairlines, you can drop a very uniform line of guides. I find this is the best way to just ensure that you don't get any strange scattering when you actually do scatter your hairs. The reason being is when you drop an actual guide generate, what it does, it will generate if you look at my mouse here, for example, and we plant a single guide, when you generate a hair around a guide, it will generate in a circle like this. So if I were to just have a single guide here with an influence radius, you would actually see that when we adjust our influence radius, it would be like adjusting the size of the circle. So it would scatter hairs in that area, and then the density of that is controlled with your density, but your influence radius is the size of the circle, and then the density there within. So looking at this area here, the problem being that when you have too few guides on a hairline, you tend to run into the problem where the actual size of the influence radius is too small, and you start getting this like bubble, or almost like you were cutting it out with a pair of craft scissors. Like, it's a very distinguishable pattern. Sometimes that's quite helpful, especially if you're looking at more of a distinguished hairline where it's got that kind of effect. But if it's an area where you just want a basic fall off, a more dense line is often required, it just turns out to be a bit easier to control. You can obviously control it further with attributes and that kind of thing, to give yourself a bit more of a specialized control over that, and we will be venturing into attributes and using them to blend various shapes and flows into areas where there aren't any hair. But this is just a useful trick to keep things easy to manage, getting it right the first time, without having to drop excess attributes. The important thing to also keep in mind, in my personal opinion, when doing a groom, is the idea of being economical with your time, as often or not in a pipeline or a production setting, the groom needs to go through various passes of approvals or checks. So it is quite useful to get a product out as soon as you can, so that the rest can start. You can start receiving feedback on your flow, shape, size, what your general ideas going forward. You might realize that they don't actually want a long mane down here, but or they don't actually want a specific color or a specific type of flow. Something's bothering someone with the ears, and then you'll be able to adjust before actually putting the time into painting attribute masks or something like that for that kind of area. So I find it's often quite advantageous to get as much as you can out of the actual guide phase, as we will be having a pretty good product at that point. Once we actually drop a hair generate on this, that gets us pretty close, pretty much in the ballpark of where we will want to be. So I'll just go through the rest of this again in a time lapse just to throw a little bit more polish on certain areas, and then we will jump back when I start moving to the neck and we can start talking about longer guides. Alright, since we've just finished up this, it's a pretty good starting point, but you'll notice that some of the guides, especially here around the back, are starting to lose a lot of their length and starting to be a bit more varying in their size. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the adjust length tool, and then we're going to set our value setting to a specific value. We can then say change it from add and subtract to set, and then using a pretty low value we can actually adjust all these hairs to actually be the exact same length. Doing this just with little clicks affords you a bit more control over that system. So we're just going to shorten them up a little bit. Right. Now, looking at the reference we have up here, we can see that everything comes to a natural point, if you will, that creates the silhouette of the face and gives us that beautiful line to accentuate the jaw. So we're going to try and achieve the same thing here. Again, starting out with our draw tool, we will draw in the general vibe that we want to achieve with the hairs. Also keeping in mind that when you draw, length is quite important, so you can actually use that to your advantage to say, if I wanted a guide here and then a longer guide here, when I drop a scatter or a plant here on a single, you'll see that the interpolation between the guides is exactly as you would expect. So that way you can drop a varying scale between the guides. Using this interpolation to your advantage is, I think, quite a crucial mindset to have when grooming. This also applies quite nicely to a scatter, very easily. And again, that is something that we can utilize to fill out varying areas of geometry. So I'm just quickly going to remove those and then continue drawing in the rest of the guides here. And you'll also notice that I've intentionally left the ears blank, as we will be doing that at a bit of a later point. As it is such a distinctly unique part of the groom, it will require a bit more finesse in terms of the more thought out guide placement and being a bit more deliberate with our strokes and our choices. So I'll just continue doing this quickly and then finish up that. So just quickly while I talk about the neck, we're going to look and see that we've got a varying number of very controlled clumps, if you will, that are quite distinguished in their profile and their form. So with that comes a bit more of a deliberate guide placement, and it's a touch more sparse. So knowing that we have tools available to us in our hair generate, we can it informs basically how we will be tackling this kind of approach. There's a lot of ways in which you can make this very complicated as a procedure, but there are a lot of shortcuts that you can also take to achieve this look or this result that aren't as complex. So I will quickly draw in the first few here under the chin. So we'll see that we've got that kind of length. And we'll be using this kind of profile for the general idea. As you can see, it's got a bit of a larger fluff around the cheeks and the face. So we'll see that it comes out like this. Again, just trying to get the length and the flow working correctly. And that coalesces and converges near the center. You'll notice that there's quite a distinctive length difference when it comes from the chin down underneath the strap. And then this is where you'll be getting most of your length. So at this point you can really start pulling the guides out. Again, your positioning, everything can be changed as we go through. So keeping it pretty light in terms of density is, I think, quite important, just to get our general flow correct. And then it shortens as it approaches the back of the neck. So that way we've actually blocked out the shape that we want to do. There's a few more unique pieces in here. So just drawing in a couple more, and as we know, the guide will flow, wrap, and actually group around the legs, and you'll see there's a bit of a distinguished, if you think back to our grouping that we broke down at the beginning of the tutorial, you'll see that this is one of those groups. So this is an area in which this length would blend in again with like a shorter groom, but we'll just continue this down the chest for now. It would flow naturally through these areas. And there's also a measure of filling in the blanks, as it'd be quite difficult to get reference for like this internal area here between the legs. If you have a cat, feel free to go give him a pet and actually have a look at the general flow that you'll be able to see there. Again, finding that kind of reference can be a little tricky, but using our sculpt tool, we will actually adjust varying areas of this now to just achieve the desired silhouette and result that we want. Using our adjust length again, we will adjust the length of these varying guides to their correct proportions. So we're just going to jump back to adjust length. Drop a few of these. We're just going to set this to adjust length, and then add and subtract and change that to a negative. This will allow us to very quickly adjust negative 0.001 as a nice brush setting. We can shoot that out just to adjust varying sizes of this, varying lengths, and we'll see that it's got a bit of a taper towards the center where the longer fur would be. Right, fantastic. And then we're going to just adjust and sculpt those out again, just to get the general feeling that we want going. So another reason you could be using parting lines would be for areas like this one here. Just let's go a little bit larger for us here. For little chunks like this where you can actually see the hairs are clumped all the way in. Personally, I prefer to use clump attributes to drive that instead of parting lines, as you get a bit more of a natural flow. For something like a reindeer or a horse or a bear, where you've got those harsh neck divisions, where you can actually see a long line that runs through the fur to actually create a distinguished part, and then something like that might be more helpful. That kind of hard clumping, but it is a bit more of a complex system to achieve that specific look, and not just parting lines. So just scattering in a few more, just to fill out some of the body of the groom. Do try and avoid little intersections like that. It's quite common when you're using your symmetry tool, your mirror tool. It just often tends to lead to something that's looking very fake or very CG, especially in areas like this where it's a bit more of a longer fur. but just general shaping and sculpting, just to get the overall silhouette right first, I find is an important part of the process. Once you get your silhouette, then you can start adding more detail. I think of it a lot like sculpting in a more traditional sense of where you would be sculpting a geometry, getting your blocking and your shapes in first for a very exaggerated groom like this, where you've got distinguished shapes in your actual groom, and the hair actually influences a lot of the character. I feel it's quite important to get that silhouette down first. If you're doing something like a short-haired cat or something like a horse hair, then your technical execution of the actual groom is a bit more important than the shape, as the shape is so finely tuned to the body. It's not really that much of an influence unless you get to something like the mane for the horse, where again, doing your silhouette and your shape of the hair is, I think, the more important part again. So just removing a lot of this, and then we will be adding a little bit back to the front here, just to give us that nice peak. And that should be good enough for now. Right, and just to give it that distinguished mane around the side, we are now going to grab our plot and just do another quick scatter, just at a bit of a lower density, just to fill us out a little bit. Quick little tests you can do is just drop a little bit and then see what kind of density you're achieving. Again, keeping it quite loose at this point, as it's still a bit of a work in progress. So you can always go back to your sculpt, smooth out various areas, dig into the actual guides themselves, and just work the shape a bit more. I feel the more guides you add, the more tricky it becomes to handle the groom, but also the more clear it is to see the actual shape and silhouette that you're trying to achieve, which is it's a bit of a hard balance to strike, but one that you do get used to over time the more grooms you do. See there, we're just gonna end it off into a little point. We've already begun to achieve a bit of the desired result. So in the past, what I used to do was to drop various guide grooms and then represent groupings in that way, but I've found that these days it's a lot easier to control areas of influence with masks and to keep everything centered into a single guide groom. For the whiskers, for example, we will be doing a separate groom tree, a separate guide groom node entirely, which I think would be just a touch easier to manage, as we can assign them their own shader at that point, and we can control their attributes a bit easier. So I'm just going to quickly finish up the detailing of this, just polish up the lower region, and I'm going to throw that into a time lapse where I'll polish up the neck, and then we can look at the rest of the body. So now that we've finished the neck of the cat, we're going to look at the rest of the body. It's essentially going to follow the same workflow that we have used for the head and the neck. Starting out with the draw tool, we'll just be laying out the general flow and forms that we see on the back here and on the legs. It's essentially the same thing, not too much different. So I'll just be throwing on another time lapse as we go, and I'll point out the important bits as we continue the grooming process. But again, as I said, it is just essentially the same workflow. next phase after we've finished the body now would be to do the ears. As I mentioned earlier, this will be a bit of a separated process requiring a little bit of a different approach. The side of a cat's ears, especially in the outside, has a bit more of a skin reveal on it. There's not as much hair. That's why we've left this little section a bit more open. We'll be planting up a few more guys just to fill up that section. As we can see, it's quite a unique split. So if I grab our reference here on the side and just pull it up a bit larger, we can see the effect that we're wanting to achieve. So currently we can see that the flow is a bit wrong. So we'll be grabbing a sculpt, increasing the strength, and just adjusting our curves to match the flow that we need. Just something like that would be all we need. Yes. Alright, now just to adjust the length there slightly, as it is a touch longer. And I do see also that our face length on the general guides here are a touch too long, so we might actually be wise to decrease those now while we are here. Just quickly going to drop this down a touch, as these are quite short hairs, especially on the central face region along the nose and the eyes. The whiskers in the mouth as well, just to get us that little bit of shape. Fantastic. I do see that the sides here are a bit longer as well, so we will go in and adjust that. And this is what the predominancy of a groom's initial guide phase would be. So we're just going to select the side of the cheek. Make sure that we selected the whole side of the cheek, just to help us isolate certain things, and then we will select our brush again. Simply hit enter, and we'll use our sculpt tool instead, just to bring this out at a touch and create that nice pointed clump on the side of the face. Alright, now for the ears, we're simply going to select our plant tool, and a wonderful new feature from Houdini19 is we can simply go down here to groups, open up our groups, tick the option to add new curves to a group, and then type in ears. This will create our new group, and then simply by clicking, we can go up to the top, select our selection, which will be the ears, which will be the new guides that we have added to the model. This is a wonderful improvement that Houdini19 has done over the past, where you would have to split the chain and assign a group manually. We'll also be doing group assignments later on. I find it's a bit easier to do group assignments once I have the base groom complete, as then I can do marquee selections and such to grab large swaths of the groom and actually break it up in terms of what I think would need to be simulated, or which grooms I would like to handle independently for grooming purposes on the geometry. Just adding a few of the guides that we'll require, then just a quick hand at a sculpt, just to achieve a bit of that desired look that we want to get, and then we'll adjust some length on some of these. They are quite long, and some are relatively short near the base, and then simply to sculpt those back into position. We'll see that it's a kind of an undercurve here, and we'll bring some of those out like so. Alright, that should handle the basics of the ear hair. Just checking that we've got all that, and since we have that, we'll probably be adding an attribute to control the density and the clumpiness and its unique look in regards to the rest of the groom, respectively. So just adding a few more just to get us a bit more resolution. One thing that I do like to do personally is while I am grooming, I tend to take my viewport a bit further out just to now and then have a look at the overall shape and silhouette, if you will, of the groom that we're busy achieving or trying to get. So looking at the reference that we have here on the second from the top, we can see that we're pretty close in a lot of areas. The neck might need a little bit more direction. So just removing our group there, we can pull out the neck just a touch more, just to get that shape back into it. The belly looks good and the feet look good. The true test, however, will come with the scattering of hair, which I think will be our next step. Just a little bit more refinement here on the ears, just to allow for some breakup. You could do this with a length node. I find it's just a little bit quicker to pop in and just add a little bit of variation with the manual brush. Can get some faster results that way. All right. Now that we've got the finished base groom, this is about the base building blocks for any groom. I would say it's time that we start looking at the hair generate node in the next segment. So moving on from that, the next node that we would require is a hair generate. Dropping that down, this generates the actual follicles that will be visible in the render or visible at render time. What it basically does is it scatters a number of curves around each guide and interpolates those curves in relation to the guides around them and the guide that its root guide, if you will. Simply have your hair gen in the scene, drag your guide groom node to your groom object, and you will see it will generate hairs. Usually they're this quite thick in the beginning. This is just the standard defaults. The first thing I like to do is go to the thickness tab and add another 0 and change that to 1.25. I find this is often a good point to start from. Definitely not your final thickness throughout, but a good point to start from in Houdini scale for a general thickness of hair. It is quite a thick and coarse hair, but you can refine as you go throughout the grooming process. And the next point, we're going to look at the density. So I like to disable the guide groom at this point to just get a better idea of what I'm looking at. Shooting this up to a factor of 100, we can see that it follows quite well. The groom's guide interpolation seems to be working quite well. We can shoot this up by a factor of 2. Alright, and then perhaps another factor of 2. Looking at that, we've got a total of about 400,000 hairs, which isn't bad. So that's still pretty light, and I do tend to work with a bit of a lighter groom in the beginning of a hair gen, just to get the result while keeping the viewport quite fast. But if you look at a close-up macro image such as this one here, and then isolate an area of the groom which is similar, this is how you can determine which density would be correct. So if we look at these two, we can see that we've got about double the density again, just to determine what we are working with here. and I would double that one more time. And that to me is starting to look a bit more correct. We likely have a large number of problems to deal with now. As you can see, the large number of the groom is quite clumpy. But as I said, I do like to work with a bit of a lower resolution in the beginning and then bump up to our final look near the end. So the first thing to do, I think, would be to add our density attributes in and our influence radius to adjust where the hairs are actually growing on the surface of the geometry, because we will see that there's a bit of overlap. For example, if you remember, we painted a density mask on the nose, and that seems to not be affected in this regard. The easiest way to quickly implement that is to, under your density, quickly adjust your skin attribute, and just it automatically fills in density for you. As you can see, we've got our density back in, so it won't grow inside the eye sockets or the nose or inside the mouth or on the areas of the ear which we painted initially. Also underneath on the paws, on the pads. The next point would be to, what I like to do is use the same attribute, implementing the density and the influence radius as well, just to get a better look at where the hairs are growing from its influence, using our mask to just enforce that hairline and keep it clean. You can also use this if you so desire. Under your skin attribute, you can also type in density and just utilize that. You'll see what that does is it makes the hairs inside this area a lot thinner. This can really help for certain hairlines, for blending certain hairs into areas of thinner density, or if you are approaching something that is balding or has naturally more sparse hair. This does offer quite a natural breakup to the hair and develops almost a natural gradient, if you will. Moving on into the context of the hair gen SOP. I think what we can do though, however, is before moving on, we can drop a material network. This will be the basis of our hair shading later on, but what we can do for now is just drop a hair shader and just using it as it is default, drag it onto our hair gen. This is just to visualize, if you will, the hair that we're currently using. Just to offer a bit more breakup on the surface of grey on grey. The brown does tend to help a bit more. What we can also do to just help ourselves see a bit better is just adjust the thickness to be slightly thicker in the viewport. Next thing we can do is we can look at the overall clumping structure. How I like to think about clumping is looking at the reference we have here is that I like to look at it in terms of its levels, starting with the smallest clumps first and building up to the larger, more prominent clumps. And using that approach, you can build the groom in a very layered design instead of isolating areas and working on them independently. You can start off with a larger area and then work your way to refining to smaller areas. So I think the easiest thing to do here would be to just look at our reference. Obviously the smallest clumps would be on the face, as they are the shortest hairs. So I think if we get this general clumping structure, very small, very sporadic, that follows throughout, this sort of almost feathering, if you will, where it forms small distinctive clumps. If we get this to follow throughout the rest of the groom, we should be in a good space to move forward. Looking at what we have now, the first step would be naturally to dive into your hair gen node, and we will be starting out with a clump node. Using this, we'll simply drop it into the chain and then connect our skin. This will start clumping the hairs, and what the node does automatically is it creates basically a scatter across the surface, and then clumps the hairs to a single point, or a single vector, if you will, imagining as if there was only a single guide in this cluster and a single guide in this cluster. You can adjust that here with a clump size, and we will be using this initially. Zooming into the face, we can get a bit of a better look and see at what we're doing. So we're going to aim for somewhere around there. Just give us a little bit more of that natural clumping. What I like to do also is just increase the iterations on your fractal clumping. What this does is it adds same how you would add a fractal noise to an attribute. This just adds a fractal noise to the clumping and mixes in different varying size reduction, whether you want the goal feedback to be towards a larger or smaller clump, and does a dynamic tightness reduction or increase to the clumping. So looking at that looks pretty good as our base layer. Something to start off with, and then we'll just name this accordingly. Base clump. Moving forward, we're going to start to look at the next layer of clumping, which would be the slightly larger clumps that we would find here on the body. We'll see that there are a range of clumps that are just slightly larger and make up a large majority of what you would see here. So this is a good position to start off with, just to take a position on trying to approach this as a more uniform segment, but we're also going to be removing the influence of the face from those clumps so that they don't affect what we've already done there. So to do this, simply add another clump, dropping it down and viewing it. Now when you do this, you will see that you've got a setting here to only clump within existing clumps. That means that it will only clump the clumps with inside the clump radiuses that we have previously set up. Those being incredibly small, we are just going to turn this off so that we can affect a slightly larger clump. And we will look at about there. That seems to be the correct density. I like to go just slightly larger, as we do have fractal clumping, which will assist us. So going over the clump node in a little bit more detail, we can actually have a look at some of the properties we have available here, some of the parameters we can set. So one of the first ones that you would look at is the crossover rate. This is basically the indication of crossing over hairs between different clumps, and increasing this would actually allow you to blend the root a little bit better so that you don't see straight through. It is a bit more natural, so I usually like to keep this at about 0.8. The next thing would be your random seed, which is just the seed for that crossover rate, just to cycle through the various iterations. Then there is the linear blend method and the extrude and blend method. Basically, these are just two different computational methods of generating the clumps. My personal favorite in this situation would be the extrude and blend. So how the clumping works in Houdini is it basically tries to force the hairs to follow an interpolation to a specific vector, and it will shorten and extend various hairs to match that. So I like to bring this down just slightly on both sides, just so that we get a little bit more of that variation inside your actual clumps. Your hair width scale. Your hair width is the size of the actual, if you would imagine a guide here, it is just the width of the thickness of that clump, and adjusting that there basically allows you to create a thicker or a thinner clump, if you will. So we're just going to increase it slightly, and then as we can see on our reference, not all the clumps are perfectly tight. There's a lot of them with a little bit of breakup. So we will just simply bring that back and then lower our tightness just ever so slightly. Increasing your stray amount would give you a bit more. Well, firstly, the stray rate gives you a certain amount of flyaways from the actual clump, and then the stray amount would be the distance that those flyaways actually differ from the clumping. So keeping this at about there, stray rate at about here, and then the stray fall off is just the length along the curve that is falling off from the influence of the clump. Then next we have the clump profile. This is basically the tightness along the clump, if we can find an isolated clump to just demonstrate the point here. So if I were to bring this down, you will see it tucks in a lot more at the base of the clump, and if I were to bring this out, it starts to expand. I prefer a bit more of a concave clump ramp. This helps the filling out of the body a lot more. Looking at the general flow, we can see that we've achieved a little bit more of the desired effect that we want here, with the choppiness, as it's got a very similar feel to what we see in the reference here, as you can see there. So we will be refining this a little bit more over the course of time, but this is again just to start to get us those initial setups. So another thing that I like to do with the clumps is, while I'm adding the small touch of fractal clumping here to just break us up a bit, is adjust the curling. So on slightly longer clumps like this, it is sometimes quite useful to give a little bit of amplitude to curling. I prefer doing this over a normal like frizz noise in most situations, just as it gives us the ability to control the level of noise a little bit more by adjusting the frequency down a little bit. We get the desired result. But yes, again, this over the frizz, as it maintains that frizz inside of a clump, and it kind of treats the whole clump as a single entity rather than the individual strands of hair. As you can see here, for example, if I go down to a macro scale, you'll see that we've got lovely curls coming in throughout. Another thing that we can do is we can do a blend. So the overall master blend will blend right back to the base groom. What we can do is we can use something called a guide mask, and this will be done to give us a bit more of a blend from the root to the tip. So we don't actually want the clumping to follow all the way through, but instead just from the tip down to the base. So we're going to switch your output type on the guide mask to point, and then we can find additional masks. You can find a curve mask, and then using the parameters given to you, you can adjust the range of the curve mask. I prefer to usually just leave it as is, as it is a full range of each curve, with the tip being 1 and the root being 0, which will, when plugged in here, first we're just going to go change the name to body clump mask. Do that, Control C, and then come into your blend and run a guide attribute, and then simply paste your attribute value in there. As you can see now, you've got a bit more of a natural fall off when it comes to the clumps, we can see that there's a bit more of a blending, or with a bit of a more even distribution of hairs at the root, which blends to a bit more of a natural look on the side and the tip. We're also just going to adjust our extension here a little bit less, and then we are going to use our first mask to power this. So since we are using the guide mask to drive the blend, and what we can also do is we can adjust the general flow using the guide mask. So you can use an input mask on a guide mask, and that you can use a skin attribute, and then this will be our previous attribute here. So we're simply going to click that button, and as you'll see, it can drop the attribute paint nodes right above here in this chain for us. You can do this and use this flow, but personally I prefer to paint directly on the skin in here, but we can just keep it in here for now, as it would be just a touch more simple to demonstrate our masks and keep track of them. But a good practice would be to keep all of your masks in one place. So painting on here, we're just going to hide the other, because currently it's showing us our skin geometry. If we hide that, we can see the mask we want to paint. So for the larger clumps, we obviously don't want it on areas where there's short fur, like the feet and the face. So we will be removing those. Don't forget to enable your symmetry. Again, a very useful tool for this would be the volume brush for your paint node. Allows you to very rapidly and quickly paint masks. Obviously we can't have a very hard masking here, so we'll just have a gradiated fall off so that the clumps naturally dissipate in their blend to the legs and the... You might need to crawl that up slightly more. Yeah, but just a natural dissipation across the body. We will be revisiting the neck, as it is a very technical clumping area, as well as the sides of the face, but we will affect that within our chain. So viewing that, we can see that it has influenced our mask, where only the areas that we are affecting are in red, and the areas we are not affecting are in black, which is very good. Just going up a level, we will just go have a look at our colored fur. We can see that we've got a pretty nice fall off across the board when it comes to the kind of clumping that we want to get. So just to go into a bit more detail, I'm just going to name this layer 1 body clump. Just keep that there, and then simply dropping another clump, we can influence the current clumps that we have. So a nice trick to know is to just clump with an existing, and then we can run a skin attribute blend where we simply use the body clump mask to drive where we want the effect to happen, and then we can keep only clump within existing clumps, and then we can lower the radius. As you can see, it'll start creating smaller clumps within the clumps that we already have. And the thing that we can do now is we can start to really affect the general look of the fur. So we've got larger clumps like this, and then we've got the smaller clumps, which are the detail layer inside the actual groom, and then enabling fractal clumping will give us a bit more variation within that, and then we'll just lower the tightness reduction just to give us a bit more looseness. Enabling curling again will give us a little bit more frizz, or we could bring it down a little bit more. We're going to lower the frequency as well to give us a bit more of a even shape. And then lower that again, just to something a bit more natural. Using that, you can see that we are busy getting more of a desired result. We pull up our reference again just to have a look at the fur up close. You can see that we're starting to get a feeling which is a bit more reminiscent of what real fur would actually look like. We can lower the amplitude on this curling again by a little bit of another factor there. The next thing that I like to do, now that we've got those clumps in place, is we've got essentially the base work of the general body clumping finished, is to do a little flyaway system. So the first part of this would be to create a guide mask. And there's a very simple way to do this that integrates quite well with the groom that you already have, and that is to change your output group to point, change your attribute to fly away, and then we are going to select a random mask. Now this will select a random random curve or random hair on your groom, and you can actually adjust the fraction or the amount that it will take. So we can have a small fraction of the hairs, such as these, and then we can run a bend guide process. And guide processes are just the collection of nodes that apply different operations to guide grooms, and we can select our masking. Our input mask would be a guide attribute, and we will select fly away. And as we work our way down the chain, we'll start to generate a nice list of masks, if you will, that we can affect as we go down, which is one of the benefits of working in a layered workflow like this. So using this operation, we can bend the angle of the flyaway slightly up, as this will simply bend the angle as a cross product of the skin normal in direction, so it will face away. You can also use a lift, but I do personally prefer the bend, as we can just include a couple more random angles. After that, what I'd like to do is set just give it a little bit of length. So we're just going to run a set length. Where we will change this to multiply, so it simply multiplies the value we're inputting to the current length, and then we're going to set this to scale. Randomizing this and selecting our guide attribute for flyaways as the mask that we'll be using. We will then increase the max scale factor just ever so slightly by, I'd say, 0.25. And that will generate for us a lovely feeling of small flyaways across the hair. What we can also do is we can add a little bit of a frizz to that, and maybe just bring this down ever so slightly. And then the bend might be a touch strong. So we will go -2. Just a bit strong. Yes. Bring that down slightly. There we go. And now just a quick little frizz, which is your general noise operator. This will apply a general noise to the fur. Quite useful in many situations. It'll be quite useful on the tail of the cat. We start off by lowering the amplitude quite a lot, bringing in our mask, skin attribute, guide attribute, my mistake, and then the flyaways, so that we can just run the operation on them. We will lower the frequency quite a lot, just to give it a little bit more noise, as you can see. And that there will give us the little bit of life that we need. We can also run a blend, as there won't be many flyaways on the face. If we bring up our face reference here, you can see it's all fairly consistent. So having the flyaways, which we're trying to create here on the face, wouldn't be too much of a good thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our guide mask, and using that previous mask that we created from the skin attribute, which was the body clump mask, we can remove that and simply generate flyaways on the body. Jumping up another layer, we can quickly have a look at our work, and we can see a bit more of a natural fall off for the flyaways that we've created. The top of the back of the cat is usually fairly smooth, so while we have kept this procedural, it is a good time for us to actually go and adjust the mask that we created here initially. So we can then remove an amount here on the back, which blends out to the tail. And that should give us a bit more of a natural fall off when it comes from the back, like so, where it's smooth at the top and then blends to a more clumpy feel at the bottom. The next thing would be the trickiness of the neck and the cheeks. So we're going to go have a look at that. As you can see, it's a very strong, long, and varied clumping with a little bit of curling at the ends and a touch of noise for the tips. So moving forward, we are going to start another clump, working again in our layer system. A clump, and I find it's often just a bit easier to just throw it in and start playing around with it. If you ever do wish to see what you're doing and remove the mask previews or the mask visualizers, you can simply adjust it here by turning on and off the visualizers tab. So while we're here, we're just quickly going to tackle the neck. So unticking clump, use existing clumps, we can then adjust to get a bit more of a clump that we want. So looking at the structure of this, we can see that the clumps are fairly large and then go into smaller clumps which follow along. This one here might be another good example. So we can see that we need larger clumps flowing into smaller clumps. So this will be a blend in clump size as well as its influence. So we can do this with a large clump and then a second layer of smaller clumps, and perhaps a third one just for polishing. So we'll get our first layer of clumping in. Just about there, looks good. And then we'll add a general shape to it, such as this, increasing the frequency just ever so slightly. And then we'll come up again and increase our hair width. Hair width scale, and then increasing a stray rate slightly, and then lowering these values here to give us a bit more variation. We can also introduce a small amount of fractal clumping, which will get us a bit closer to our desired result, but not exactly all the way there. Next, we're quickly going to look at the size again, as it seems to be a little bit off, and then just do a little bit of a crossover as well. The size, I believe, needs to be just a touch different. There we go. Our fractal clumping might be a little bit too high as well. Yes, as we do want to be able to distinguish between the different clumps on the neck, as it is quite an important feature. Our hair width scale might also be just a touch too big. Wonderful. And then our tightness can come down just ever so slightly. A linear blend check sometimes does help as well. And as we can see that we are getting a bit more of a vastly different result when it comes to this this shift in operation. I think this does work a little bit better for this specific example, as we do get a bit more of that distinguished clump. So we can then increase our curling just ever so slightly. Yes, very good. And then we will just bring up that random seed just a little bit, just so we get something that feels a bit better. And then we are pretty well on track there. Very good. Now we can introduce our masks for this area. So firstly would be our primary mask that we can use to build our layers on top of. So using this, we are first going to generate a curve mask as we did before to blend it back into the skin. So turning on our visualizers again, we'll be able to see the range min and max, and we want a pretty hard groom, like a hard clump. So we'll bring down the range max to localize the fall off a bit further back. We can also do that with the fall off option. Next will be an input mask, which will be from the skin geometry, and this will be our neck clump mask. Generating this will allow us to isolate this style of clumping just to the neck of the character. So just to isolate that quickly, we will fill with 0 and then paint volume with 1. Don't forget to turn on your symmetry, and then we will crawl this up slightly, and then down the side of the leg and around the back of the neck, and then smoothing that out to give us a bit more of a natural fall off, as we will also be using this mask to drive the blend of the size of the clumps, which we can plug in. So doing this, we will also bring this, as it might be quite useful to bring this to the underbelly. As I said before, it is quite important to be very economical with the work that you do, so we may be able to get twice the value for the work we're doing now if we use this kind of clumping structure on the belly as well. And that looks pretty good to me. So we will just crawl that back underneath the chin, as we know that it is pretty clean there, and then give a little bit more life on the side of the face where we've got these strong clumping influences here. Very good. Alright, now piping that back into our guide mask, we can see that that is the influence that we're having currently, and then going back to our clump, we can see what kind of effect it is having. What we can also do now is we can bring the blend in using the guide attribute, and then using our neck clump mask. By using the neck clump mask in the output, we can then just drop it here in our blend attribute, and as you can see, the effect is localized to the area which we have isolated. So using this, we will be able to affect just the areas that we want to, and then increasing our blend back up to 1, we can see the fall off that we have. Now the biggest problem is that some of these areas are a bit too large in their clumping, and we're going to want a fall off in clump size. So luckily we can still use the same attribute for the neck clump mask on the clump size. So this will have a natural fall off, decreasing the clump size as it gets further out to the influence area. So looking at what we have now, we can see that we've got a bit starting to get more in line with the reference. The next area that we're going to draw our attention to would be the tail and the rear hind section. So playing off the fact that we've already got our base clumps in, and looking at our reference here, we can see that it is a pretty stringy, wiry kind of hair that's got a lot of noise to it. So what we're going to do initially is we're going to build up our new clumps for the tail, and then introduce a lot of noise, most of which we will be able to do inside the clump node itself. So bringing that down to about the size that we would require, and removing the ability to only clump within existing clumps. As we can see, that is kind of the general feeling that we're getting from the tail here, where it's a lot smaller in clump size, and then we will be dropping a little bit of stray rate onto it with a lot of crossover, and then increasing our stray rate even more, and then lowering our tightness a touch, lowering the stray rate just a little bit more, increasing the hair width scale, and dropping that to a linear blend to get that tighter feel. Stray rate, and then, as I said before, I do prefer a bit more of a convex shape in this situation. And then we will be introducing a frizz. The frizz, we're going to keep the frequency quite low, but the amplitude is going to be a bit higher than. And as we can see, that is more along the desired effect that we want. We can bring the general blend down just a touch, just to get us more in line with what we see here. I do see a lot of length variation here as well, and there's a bit of a noise. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to drop another guide mask, and we're going to start refining the feel that we're generating here. So switching back on our visualizer, we're going to change this to point and start with a curve mask and a noise mask. The noise mask basically projects a mathematical noise across the surface, and then, as you can see here, if I adjust the frequency, the noise influences in a noise pattern across the fur. So we will get a pretty high frequency, and then lower the gain just ever so slightly, with a bias more towards that. We can overdrive this as well to give us a bit more of a higher frequency. You can also introduce a bit of a fractal noise, or center your noise around 1, which clamps it. I do prefer to just keep this as simple as possible, as you can start really getting carried away with the amount of mass that one can add to this. I do want a bit more of an amount there, and to lower the frequency just ever so slightly to see a bit more of a directed impact. Now, what we can do is we can use this as the tail mask, and then bring in a paint node from here. From the mask, we will, on our input mask, generate a skin attribute and call this tail mask, and then paint this to be what we need it to be, which would be just the rear section. So quickly just filling that with 0, volume on the tail, and bringing that across. Do not forget to enable your symmetry. And then, as we can see, it does crawl a bit onto the hind legs here at the back. So we will be bringing this into the fold as well, and then blending that in through the body. So here, and then bringing that underneath as well, as it will blend like so. It's very important to fill in the blanks sometimes as to how things would actually fall naturally, and using a bit of common knowledge, you can start to generate that kind of observational influence of your work, and just that being informed. The more you do things, the more you realize how things are put together, I guess. There we go. Alright, using our tail mask, we can go back in here, and it's already been isolated on input. Now to implement that throughout, our blend will be a skin attribute for our tail mask and our frizz we'll be using a guide attribute to blend, which is our tail mask. Looking at this, turning our visualizer off, we can see the general influence that we've had here. A general thing that we can do to just give it a bit more of this natural look would be a set length. Now I'm going to do one here at the end of the chain, and we're simply going to keep using this as we go throughout, as I believe it just one of these at the end of your chain, just to give it a little bit more variance in the length of certain hairs will go a long way for the groom overall. So if we just lower the minimum slightly by about 0.1, we'll get a bit more of that breakup, which is quite nice, I think. And then we can go back to our frizz, go back to the operation, and then adjust from there till we get the desired look that we want. I think we can increase our frequency slightly and introduce some randomness to that, just to give it a bit more of that natural feel. I think the clump size could also you do with some blending, so we will use a skin attribute again for our tail mask, and then bring that clump size down just a touch, and maybe introduce a bit more fractal clumping, which should variate that a touch more. As we can see that there's a clump here that is a bit out of place. That is obviously being driven from our guides here. So we can at any point in time go back and just adjust. I'll be adjusting by adjusting the length of the guides here, and then just increasing them. I think we do have a selection planted, yes. So just doing that, we can adjust this here, and that these changes should follow through. So grabbing our sculpt brush again, just neatening up our shape. It's always important to iterate as you go through a groom, making corrections and refining as you go. As we see now, some problems only become evident as you start with the further stages of the grooming process, but due to the nature of the workflow we've implemented, it is quite easy to keep things procedural and easy to change in a chain. As the flow is a bit more linear, it's more of a layered approach. It is easy to follow the changes as you do them. As we can see now, we've got another element of the groom finish, the back rear legs. Next we are going to look at the paws and the front legs. See that we need to adjust a little bit of the length. So keeping our reference in mind here, we can see that in comparison there is a disparity in the length when looking at the relation to the flow going up. So we're going to need a lot longer fur here that tapers down to what we have here on the actual paws. On the hind leg, we can see that we also need a much longer type of fur with a bit more of a prominent clumping present here. We can also see that on the tail end of things, we might need a little bit more just length on the blend between the rear section here and the actual tail. Looking at the shoulder from this angle, we can also see that we've got a bit of a flow discrepancy between our reference and what we have here, and also the general flow of this here into the neck doesn't seem to blend that well. So we'll address all those issues quickly. Just revisiting some of the masks that we already have and the guides that we placed down initially. So going back to our guides, we are quickly going to do just a slight adjustment to the flow, just to give us a bit more of that that forward direction, which is so prominent in our reference, and a bit more shaping as well. I think would stand to benefit from. Another thing we can do is we can just use our clump just ever so slightly, just to bring some of these points together. And then with a little bit of a final touch on the sculpt, just to add a little bit of curve into the guides, just to help our process along. Also just bring in a few more clumps just to straighten the tips of our actual structure. There we go. Then looking at it from the front, we can see that we need to perhaps do a selection mask just to adjust our profile from the front, just to get that good central mane type of feel where we get the taper towards the middle of the mane in the middle of the neckline. Fantastic. And then just a bit more of a flow adjustment, just bring it down slightly, just blend that out. Wonderful. Just bringing this forward, we will just shorten this up just a touch, and just bring that further in to sort of thin out the profile of the cat slightly. That looks like a good silhouette. Adjustment. So clearing our guide mask, we'll quickly just revisit the rear end here, and then the blend between the tail and the hind legs. We'll just do a bit of a length adjust here. And I think we'll also just do a bit of a removal on some of the longer points like this, where we can just blend that back in. Just add a little bit and take some away, like so. This should act as a bit more of a natural curve for the tail, and allow us to blend the tail in a little bit easier. Next, I think we'll do an increase on our guides again, where we increase the length of the fur here and here, just to give us that blend to the front foot. Then we will just do a blur between those, just to even them out slightly. This does also help you adjust on the length front. We can see we've got a little bit of a hole here that we can quickly fill. We just show our skin. Go to the plant tool, and then hit a couple of guides here in this armpit area. Just fill that out a little bit. We can see that this area here is a bit flat, so we'll just go grab our sculpt tool and then just even this out. See, we're catching the back foot there, and we'll just even this out a little bit. So as most any good guide, any good groom that is, the grooming process is never really finished when it comes to your guides, and there's always a good opportunity to revisit, to readjust and to refine as you move along the pipeline for the groom. We'll then just do an adjust length again, where we will shorten some things up again, just to blend some of these longer sections back. Make sure that we get a good profile, and then pull those out to the side, because as we can see, the hair doesn't actually fall this way, but actually comes out from the leg in a bit more of a straight fashion. So we should be able to recreate that like so. Just giving it a bit more volume in the third three-dimensional. Then looking at it from the top allows us to just create that profile a bit easier, and then also inwards as well. Slight corrections to be done on the back end as well, just to ensure that our feet remain consistent, as we have been tweaking around them a little bit. You can see a bit of a discrepancy there in the shoulder, in the profile. Looking at it from the top, just to ensure that it is a bit smoother. There we go. And then just giving it a bit more of that flow. This is where the blur brush comes in quite handy again. Just giving us the ability to blend these in with each other again, and give us that smoother gradient with flow. I'm just going to fill in a few more holes, and then we can go have a look at our result here. Turning back on our hair, we can see the changes that we implemented. And as we can see, it is a lot closer to what we are looking to achieve. With that more prominent direction in the neck, bit of a smoother blend on the tail, and a much smoother blend on the legs. We're going to be looking at the clumping on the legs, and we'll be adding a bit more of a blend between the larger clumps and the smaller clumps, just to smooth out this transition slightly. We'll also be looking at the belly and adding a bit more of a thicker clump, a tighter, more ordered pattern there, and then the back of the legs will also require some length adjustment in our guides, which we will quickly go do. For the sake of time, I'm quickly going to go do the minor adjustment on the guides, and then a couple more polish pieces, just ensuring that we are ready to move on to the next step. I'll also be increasing the length of the hair here. Now that we've done those polish passes, we're quickly going to look at the clumping for the legs. To do that, similar to what we were doing prior, we are simply going to repeat a similar workflow by adding a new clump node. And viewing that as so. We're going to tick off only clump in existing, and then, as we have done before, using this to just determine our general flow of the clumps and the size. This image is slightly lower in resolution, so I'm just going to move it up to the side just so that we can have a better look at what we're trying to make. As we can see, it's a very pointed kind of clumping. So bringing that clump size within range of what we want, and then adding a slight amount of curling just to adjust there, and then increasing the frequency just to give us a larger overall curl. Our fractal clumping, we will engage that slightly just to give us a little bit of a more conceited breakup with a few more variants underneath. And then general, we'll just add a slight stray rate, bring the stray amount slightly down, decrease our tightness ever so slightly, and then increase our hair width scale with a lot of crossover, just to give us that similar effect. We can increase our tightness a little bit, I think would be a good thing, with a little less of a stray rate, just to give us a slightly more directed clumping. Stray fall off can fall away a little bit, and I think maybe switching this to linear blend to get a bit of a tighter clump would be a good idea. We can then also increase our clump profile to a convex profile, just to thicken up our clump surface so slightly. At this point, I think we can increase the iterations of our fractal clumping, decrease the size reduction just to keep it a bit more consistent, and the goal feedback would be to just push it forward a little bit with a bit more tightness reduction. I think that there is the desired effect that we want. Using this now, I'm going to quickly drop us a skin attribute, but I think we'll build this off of a guide mask instead. That way we can make use of some of the fantastic operations available here. Switching to point, using leg mask as our attribute, we can then switch to additional masks, curve mask to get a bit of a fall off there so that it blends well into the root, and then just a touch of a noise mask with a slightly higher frequency, and then we can lower the gain just to give it spread a bit more, and then the amount can come down slightly. We'll then do a skin attribute input mask and call that leg mask from this skin. Selecting that, we can jump into here and then fill with 0 volume. And as we can see, the toes are a bit of a different story. So what we will do is we will just have a blend that runs up to here and then to the shoulder. Do not forget to enable your symmetry. Blending like so and like so. We create that triangle in the front. It is very prominent in the front of the leg, as we can see here, and slightly less so on the side, and I'm assuming a lot more on the back. Animals tend to have a lot more clumping on positions such as joints, like the knees or the toes of the tip, and then around the neck and the ears, behind the ears. And you'll see this often in animals like wolves, dogs, anything canine, deer. Most animals with fur will have a bit more clumping around areas of articulation, as the fur there is often compressed, and then the clumping structure tends to change as there are wrinkles present underneath the fur in those locations. But moving forward, just increasing the blend here slightly and just blending into our previous grooves. We seem to have lost our triangle there a little bit, so we'll just blend that a little bit back. Fantastic. Now we'll quickly give it a look and see what it looks like. And we'll be using a guide attribute, which is our leg mask. Fantastic. Switching off that, look, we can see that is leaning a bit more towards the desired effect that we want. Very good. We will now also include the rear end into our leg mask. Enabling our visualizer again, and then just shifting the geometry over to have a look. We can see that it's very present around the back and up the leg. So this one should be fairly straightforward. Just blending through, up the leg, and blend out. Very good. We'll just blend that to the tips of the toes, and I think the same here, just to get a bit more of that structured clumping that we seem to see here. Just blend that out. Very good. again to the side, we can have a look at our groom. And we can see that we're getting a bit more of the desired result that we want. As we can see, we also have a bit more of a clumping issue to address here at the bottom. It's slightly more frizzy with a bit more directed clumps that are a bit smaller. So to do that quickly, we can see we're already almost there on most of these. But I think a little bit more push and pull will get us to where we're going. So to just quickly add our clump node, popping that in there, connecting that to the skin. As you can see, we've started building up quite an impressive structure so far. Before I continue, a small piece of advice that would be quite useful is to start looking at exactly what you're doing, and maybe organizing them in certain fashions, just for later reference, so that we can refer back to this. We can look at the actual clumping for the next area. So switching off our visualizer and having a look, we'll be searching not only clumping within existing clumps, but looking at the belly of our cat here. So we can see that the clumps are fairly thin, with a high level of frizz and noise around the shorter clumps, and then sort of a large amount of curl in it. So this would very definitely be a linear blend to give us that kind of stringy flow, slightly larger in the size with a touch more curling, slightly higher frequency, I would say, and then a bit more crossover with a bit more of a stray rate. You can see if we just influence the stray rate, we start to achieve this similar kind of look. Stray fall off we can adjust, stray amount slightly down, and just adjust the tightness level. And then just looking at that little section, we can see that we've started to achieve the correct flow. Just gonna shift the reference down here slightly just to keep it out of our way. And then just blending that in, we'll be using a simple skin attribute, which we will create now, called belly mask. Clicking here simply drops our skin attributes again, and then turning on our visualizer, filling with 0, and painting in just a belly mask. Do not forget to enable your symmetry. And then blending that up on the sides, just to give that little bit of blend to the rest of the groom. We could probably drag this back here a little bit just to give a bit more shape to the areas that we can't see, and then blending that up just a touch more. So having a look at this now in our groom, we can see that we've got the lower side affected in the way that we want, blending gently up into the sides, and then affecting the smaller areas like the underside of the chest and the rear end. Taking a look at the side, we can see that it might be a bit strong, so we can actually bring the blend down globally, just blend us back into the area that we want to be. We can see that we're a bit short here. If we look at the profile, we should maybe look at lengthening that a little bit, which I will quickly do in a time lapse. Now that we've corrected the lengths of the grooms, we're quickly just going to look at blending out the rest of the neck. We had a problem previously where we ran into a slight issue with the neck blending in correctly with the rest of the groom at this point here. So looking at it now, we can see that it's probably a mask issue. So if we go back inside our hair generate and just quickly have a look at our masks, turning on our values, we'll just do a little bit of a blend just across the board at this little section here. As we can see, there's very little actual clumping being affected here on the neck. So looking further, that is our tail groom and our leg mask. Alright, that would be our belly mask. So I think our neck mask will just bring the body clump. We'll just blend that in a little bit more with the rest of the head and up there around the neck. And then having a look at our hair generate again, we can see that we've blended that in slightly better. I think we could just also do an adjustment on the length of the fur in this location, as it does seem to crop up a little bit more in terms of its flow. So by simply going in here and grabbing our blend, we should be able to our blur brush here, and then just switching on our skin, we can see that there's a touch of a problem there. So just blending that out a little bit, we can see that there's also a gap in the density of the guides. So just quickly going to run a plant through there, where we just fill in some of those gaps. A couple more gaps I can see there and over here. Fantastic. Looking at that, seems to look good. The flow seems correct. And just filling in a few more little holes there. Alright, now we can go back and have a look at our hair gen again. And we can see that that is blended a bit better into the body. So now that that's done, we can quickly turn our attention to the ears and do a quick little clumping for them, a little clumping structure, and paint the bases of the masks that we will need to push that a bit further. So again, starting with the clump, connecting our skin, and then adjusting from there, we can see the kind of clumping that we would require for small areas like the ears. We can see that it's one large clump and then a series of smaller clumps. So we're going to lean quite heavily into the fractal clumping. So using the clump size, we're just going to find a distinctive size of clump that we think would work quite well. That looks pretty good to me there. And then we are going to uncheck preserve length differences, linear blend, and extrude blend. Having compared those options, we can see that we need to increase the tightness to about there, give us a bit more of a stray rate, and then give us a bit more of a crossover, and then introduce some fractal clumping. With a touch of curling, just to give us a little bit of that noise back. I'm going to lower the frequency quite a lot, and then blend that way down. Maybe increase that the curling amplitude just a touch more, with a bit more of a higher frequency. Curling, bringing that down a bit to touch, and that right there is beginning to look a bit more this area inside as to what we would require. We can then also shorten to match, reduce that so that we get a little bit more of the longer hairs, and I can see there's a bit of the curling situation there that is running into a few problems. So just adjusting that, and then our fractal clumping might be turned up just a smidgen too high. Yes, So that'll give us those distinctive clumps and thinner disparity of hair. Perhaps even adjusting our clump size a little bit more, and then finding a seed that looks good. Alright, now that that is done, we can go in and we can adjust the mask. So using a guide mask, dropping that above, and then simply using the ear mask as our attribute, changing it to point, giving it skin attribute, and painting in an ear mask. Doing so will drop us back to our skin, enable the visualizer, hit enter, hide the other skin, fill with 0, and volume back to 1. Because it's the ear, we're going to paint with a surface instead so that we don't affect the outside. So we can just simply paint the inside points of the ear. Again, don't forget to enable your symmetry. And just painting like so, we can see that we may want to affect some of the hairs here in the front, so perhaps just a light blend there. We are pretty macro in the scale, so it might be wise to actually keep a looser touch and then refine after we see the effect, as there's not a lot of detail available to us here with this level of attribute painting due to the resolution of the mesh. So looking at that, dropping back into the hair clump and using a guide attribute, which would be our ear mask, and then using this guide mask to just drop a curve mask on it as well, just to blend us out a little bit. And as we can see there, we've got nice clumping, a few flyaways, and a bit more of that scraggly look to the hair with a bit more frizz. What we can also do is we can do a set length, that is a set direction. Just drop a set length, dropping that under the clump, connecting to the skin, changing it to multiply, and selecting scale, with the masking being a guide attribute of our ear mask. We can then randomize and just scale up the length of those ears just a touch. We may actually switch to using a skin attribute, which would be our ear mask. And then here, this would allow us to just adjust the length of those ear hairs. We can also drop a bend to just give it a bit more dimension and just adjust our vector just slightly. We'll be using a skin attribute for our ear mask and just adjusting accordingly. Slight random angle for some noise and a randomness bias. Bring that back down and increase it slightly. Bring it forward just a touch, just to bring it outside of the ear. As you can see, that is a bit more of the desired effect that we want to achieve. Random angle, and bring the blend down slightly. There we go. And that being the end result of our base hair grooming. If you remember back to the beginning, we changed the thickness, so we'll be dropping the thickness back down to 1.25 and increasing the general density back up to about 16. Utilizing this, we can actually just seeing our result here, I think it might be more wise to actually increase our hair thickness just a touch, and then our density, which is our primary density map, we can go back in and adjust that. My recommendation would be areas with a really thin or short hair like this often suffer from penetration issues where you are able to see directly through to the base root of the fur and actually can see skin underneath, especially on areas like that, whereas longer areas tends not to be a problem. So what we're going to do is we are just quickly going to go in and have a look at our density mask, which was this one here. And what you can do is you can actually overdrive this value. So double density, and then just painting in those areas will allow you to increase the density twice to that scale. It is a bit difficult to see, but you could just paint this in another mask and overlay that on top. I prefer to just do this a bit quickly, just to give us a bit more density in those areas, specifically just the face. We can see that is blended a bit better with the density that we would require. Alright, just glancing over the general feeling that we have now so far, I think it's quickly time that we move on to the whiskers, and then maybe before doing that, visit the top of the ears back here. So doing that, I think we quickly need to go revisit our guides, and then show our skin geometry. Selecting our sculptor tool, we can just give a bit more life to the ear area back here. There we go. So looking at the result that we have now, I believe that is a good, if not initial phase, but more close to the final result that we are wanting to achieve. There are a couple more areas which we could be doing a little bit more clump refining, such as behind the head here, along the ears. A bit more density refining along the ears specifically, I think would be very beneficial. And then a touch here, but I think for the sake of this tutorial, we'll be moving on to creating the whiskers quickly, and then I will do a general polish pass at the end, just before we do a render pass. So to create the whiskers, what we'll be doing is we'll be creating another guide groom node. I found the easiest way to do this is usually just pop a duplicate. And you've got your skin already built in, and then dropping a guide groom. Just quickly removing up the guides that are already here. We're just going to run a quick delete across the surface. And then we have a fresh mesh. So looking at a cat's whiskers, cats typically have got 24 whiskers. That is a usual average number. They can have more, but it's usually 12 on each cheek and arranged in 4 horizontal rows of 3. There are longer hairs. They're the longest whiskers on the cat's face, but there are other whiskers located on various other parts of the cat, like above the brow or underneath the chin, which are a lot shorter. There is also a few whiskers located on the feet of the cat, believe it or not, but those are pretty negligible when it comes to the visual groom when viewed at a full body angle. So looking at this, the 12 whiskers, the important rules to keep it grounded in reality is that you keep them, whether it's 24 or more, they should be even and have the same number of whiskers distributed per side, unless you have the cat is damaged or is missing whiskers in some way, or is hurt or injured. The whiskers are also locked specifically to the size of the cat, and are designed, well, not designed, but are in a way so that the whiskers come to the outside profile of the cat, so that the whiskers are actually wider than the cat's profile from the front. And using this information, you can be informed of whisker placement and its position throughout. But to get a bit more of a accurate placement for the whiskers, what we're going to do first is apply a basic texture to the mesh so that we can see the placement of the whiskers holes, so that they correspond with the actual color map that we'll be using. So jumping back into our matte net over here, we're just going to drop a principal shader, and using the built-in texture abilities, the built-in texture properties panel here, we're just going to use a base color. And then, having selected that, we will simply drag it onto the mesh. If your texture does not appear, so you can simply enable it here by the display materials object. An easy thing to do now is just to increase the roughness to the maximum value so that we can see, and then increase our base color to a white. Now we can clearly see the locations, or almost clearly see the locations of the whiskers and their placement. So what we'll be doing now is going back here and selecting our guide groom, and then selecting our draw tool, as I do find that is still the easiest method. As we can see, the whiskers tend to fall in a sort of downward sloping curve. Some of them do maybe curve up a little bit around the top area, and we will keep that in mind. So in 4 rows of 3, what we'll be doing is so 4 per line. Alright, and then just to adjust these a little bit, give them a gentle curve. We can now generate the hairs. So using a simple hair generator, I'm just duplicating this one, going inside and cleaning up the network tree. And selecting our new guide groom as the groom object, and then ticking this box here, render guides, replaces the hair generation instead of using the guides to scatter, but using the actual guides and just replacing them with hairs. Since we can see that the follicle of the whisker is a lot thicker, we can actually increase this to about 8, or perhaps even a 2. And those are the whiskers that we'll be using. I think the 8 was the preferred thickness there. Now, enabling both, we can have a look at the cat as a whole. We are quickly going to make a hair shader for our whiskers. Just applying this hair shader to that, and hair shader for whiskers, renaming it, using the root color to be a slightly darker color on the more desaturated scale, and then our tip color being white with a touch of yellow, just to introduce some pigmentation. looking at that now, we can see that the gradient is still a bit too smooth, so we will just adjust the root to tip blend to be a bit more harsh. And just like that, we have whiskers. Adjusting the hair shader for our body, we can go into the root color and the tip color. Now I'm going to disable tip color, and simply using the root color, we are going to use the same mask that we are using to drive the texture on the body. Selecting it so, from where we already pasted it, I'm simply going to introduce it to the hair shader and change the tip color to white. As we can see, that changes the fur to pick up the point color underneath it, and we start to get a lovely finish on our fur. Now we'll go more in depth on the hair shader later on, introducing randomness, talking about transmission and secondary reflection as well as opacity when we start getting to the rendering phase of things. But just as a final touch, I'm quickly going to go and polish up the areas that still need polishing on the back of the neck, for example, or the other areas. And I'll also show you how to use attributes to affect the lightness of certain areas. Say now we wanted to lighten up the neck a little bit, or introduce our own level of shading to the cat. Having gone over the quick little areas that needed correction, we simply blended out the neck into the back of the head slightly, and then blended that slightly up into the ears just to get a bit more of the clumping effect in the actual hair, to blend out a little bit better from the neck area. Looking at what we have now, I could say that this is a pretty good point to start switching into the rendering phase of things. So we'll be rendering in Mantra and setting up our render nodes just quite quickly. I prefer to set them up in my own ROP network instead of the usual out context. It's just a touch easier for me to keep control over various Mantra networks when I have them available to me in the object at on object level. So we'll just call this one here render main, and I already have a scene preset up for the rendering of the cat. So we'll just rotate this into position. And using this, we can select our camera, and it is set up for us to engage our first render. So we'll just quickly go over the render settings in the Mantra ROP. And what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at primarily the pixel samples. There's a large amount of other parameters here if you haven't yet used a Mantra as a render engine. But I think the first thing to do here is to adjust the pixel samples. But I'll do a render first to show you why. So just quickly kicking off a light render here. We'll just select our ROP and engage a render. An important note when it comes to rendering hair with single display flags is to ensure that your guide grooms have their display flag enabled, or the hair gen won't render. A trick that some people, including myself, like to use is to pull the final hair out of the hair gen subs and place them inside of a different caching node to be able to read out the hair to a file cache of some sorts and then read that back in. So with these two enabled, we'll just re-enable our render. some of the elements are a bit harsh. So this is a good point for us to come in and address some of these elements. But staying on topic with the shading for the moment, I think we can get a little bit of the feel right across the fur. Currently it's quite desaturated and quite dark in certain places. We were losing a lot of color and it feels quite muddy. Also the hair is a bit harsh in terms of its transmission of light and its reflectivity and such. So venturing into our hair body shader, we'll have a look at our first tab. So the first tab here, we can look at the tint intensity, just giving this an IPR render just so that we could have a updating sequence as we do adjustments. I'll be selecting this little section of fur as it is, in my opinion, a little bit more interesting and captures a bit more of the information that we're trying to nail down. Another thing to notice also is that our belly here is missing a lot of this the shape detail here, so it's something that we may look at addressing. Also perhaps a generalized frizz layer across the surface of the cat might bring forth a little bit more of that natural feel. So looking at our IPR here, we can do an adjustment. I like to increase the tint intensity of the map that we're actually using, just ever so slightly. That should give us a bit more of a saturated color and a stronger pull on the color used in the mask, in the texture. An important thing to keep in mind is to create snapshots as you go across as you make adjustments, as it is a bit more easy to reference if you are able to flick between previous frames. We're going to up the intensity of the primary reflection so slightly. What this does is basically increases the intensity of the color of the hairs, if you will. It is treated as a primary reflection on top of that. It's quite misleading in its naming as a reflection, but I'd look at the primary reflection as your primary light interaction, giving you your primary diffuse color on the hair, if you will. As you can see, that lightens things up quite a lot and kind of enriches that color. If we look at our previous frame, and then moving on to our secondary reflections, I usually like to keep this the way it is, but for softer fur like a cat's fur, where we've got a lot less of an oil across the surface of the fur, or it's a lot less thick and wiry, it doesn't have as much sheen to it. I like to keep the intensity quite low, and we'll just decrease the size just ever so slightly. What this will do is it will sharpen the highlights across the various catches and areas of light bounce across the actual clumps of the fur, just to give a bit more detail. The other thing that we can do is we can go to transmission. I like to increase the intensity of this quite a lot, as I find it's just a way to crank the feeling of actual light transmission throughout the fur. What we can also do is we can stop the render for the minute while we quickly go through these settings. A very useful addition to the hair shader is the randomness tab, where we can actually adjust the specular intensity. I like to randomize this, and this randomizes per strand. So randomizing the specular intensity kind of mutes the coat and actually gives it a bit more of a broken up feeling when it comes to the way light interacts with the hair. Feels a lot more natural. Use these with caution. they can be quite useful in many situations, but can very quickly start to change the desired look that you have to go for. Opacity. I'll do a render quickly, and then I'll show you the effect that transparent shadows can have on a fur. I find it's actually quite useful to use this to achieve to almost cheat various looks, as enabling your transparent shadows will give you a very soft look on the fur, which is something that we'll be wanting to go for here. But keeping it disabled, you get a bit more of a hard edge line to your the contrast in the shadows inside the various clumps of the fur. This is quite advantageous when doing something like a gorilla fur or a horse mane, where the hair is a lot less transparent and doesn't play as well with light. We'll do a snapshot here so that we can reference the previous take. So just simply by enabling the transparent shadows, it is going to mute a lot of the contrast that we see inside of this, and that'll give the illusion of a lot softer of a fur. As we can see, we've achieved a look here that is a lot closer to the kind of lighting vibe that we've wanted to achieve here. The fur, as you can see, is also a lot softer looking. If we can just get a bit of a clean render here, you'll see that it feels a lot more gentle in terms of its contrast. We can actually go and we can tone down the tint intensity, I think, just ever so slightly. And now to also just bring us back to the ROP network, we can have a look at our render main. And as I said, one of the important parts is the pixel samples. And looking at our pixel samples here, we can see that here in the clean section of the render that we had, we notice that the hairs along the tips are starting to they seem very pixelated, and we get these little gaps between the pixels. This is basically something that we can adjust here from our overall pixel samples. I like to double this to about 6, and then just doing a snapshot before I refresh, it'll be very clear the difference that we'll be able to see in this in a moment. As you can see, that smooths out a lot of the subdivision curves that we're rendering, giving them a bit more of a smooth fall off. This is just a lot higher resolution, something that is quite needed for hair and fur, in my opinion. But utilizing this, we're just quickly going to click off, refreshing our IPR, and just doing a clean render of the frame, which I will time lapse now. So judging the result of the render that we've just finished here, we can see that there are a couple of problems that we need to address. Whenever you are grooming, the next phase of like polish is after your first render, and then iteratively after that, as you do sequential renders to check your look and feel, because only when you see how the fur actually interacts with the light and is rendered with its correct shading can you really see the effect that the fur has, and how it falls on each other, and how the flow looks when it's actually combined together. It's a bit difficult to tell in the viewport, but systematically breaking it down, we can see that here along the side of the face we have to do a bit of refinement. We need to adjust the length of the hair on the ears. The hair on the mouth could use a little bit of lengthening, and the hair on the legs needs to be readjusted on the sides here with the flow, and this needs to be broken up as the clumping is a touch too strong here. The direction can also be adjusted here, and we need a little bit more clumping here on the belly to fall more in line with what we have here. We can also adjust the back here to actually give it some shape and form, and then the legs here at the back also need some blending. I'm quite happy with the tail, how that looks at the moment, and I feel like a general layer of frizz throughout could be used. So I'm quickly going to go and make those adjustments, and then we can have a look at our results in a moment. Alright, now that we've done a lot of the polishing corrections, I think it's time we quickly tackle the appearance of the ears and the neck. Say, for example, you wanted to adjust the texture that's coming through on the fur and the shading to, for example, give the neck and the up around the mouth a little bit more value. For example, increase the lightness level of this with the ears. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be painting a attribute mask in our skin, which we will call attribute paint. And using the attribute paint node, we are simply going to drop it in and then change the attribute to the name of the neck color shift, keeping in mind to keep our underscores in place. And utilizing this, we can go in and we can make a few color adjustments. So we will be using this, and we're simply going to paint the area similar to the masks that we used prior to isolate the area in which we want the effect to take place, less so than the actual color that we want to use, as this is incredibly dependent on the method of that in which you're using to apply a color to your fur. One of the methods you could use is by painting attributes straight onto the mesh. You can paint a color attribute and actually come in and texture the creature. In our situation, it wouldn't be as applicable, as the mesh does not have the resolution to support that kind of workflow. But in some cases, you can do a similar kind of approach. Say now, if you wanted to add a couple more spots or a specific pattern to the fur, you could do something like that. We'll also be hitting the inside of the ears with a surface brush, and then blending that out towards the bottom, just to give us a little bit of control over the ear hair that we generate. Blending that up onto the head, and just removing a little bit as we go. Yes. So the next important step would be, after we've painted our color mask, to just ensure that we pass the attribute through the guide groom, pass the attribute through the skin, and then finally output the attribute in our prims. And then changing back to our primary mesh, we're going to go into our material network. And in our render view, we are just quickly going to pull out our hair body shader and rebuild this from scratch. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pulling in our UV coordinates first, and then pulling in the texture that we want to use, connecting our UV space. We will then pull in the texture which we want to use, which will be the same as the body fur, and then connecting that to a color correct. We can then create a shift in the color to increase the value just so slightly. You can also up your gamma slightly and maintain a little bit of that saturation with the loss. What I like to do is I like to connect that directly to the root color so that we can see what our differences that we're working with, taking a snapshot and doing a re-render. Also, do not forget to disable the use map parameter in your shader. As we can see, we are already getting a little bit more of the desired result with that lighter color that we're looking to achieve. We can tone it down ever so slightly just by bringing the value down a touch and the gamma down a touch, just to tone it down a little bit, as it is a bit too yellow. We can switch on our IPR render to just get a bit of a faster result. And then just looking at what we have here, we can see that we've already achieved a bit more of the desired result that we want. So using this, we are going to do a blend using a color mix, using the base color as our primary input, and our color adjustment here, our color correction, as our secondary input, giving ourselves just a little bit more space here to work with. We will take our color mix and we will put that straight into our root, and then bind the attribute which we created earlier, being the neck color shift, to the bias of the color mix. This will say that to use the area that we want as the area that we isolated when we painted our attribute. Alright, now that we've finished up the base groom and the texturing phase of things, I think we're in a pretty good space to actually move on to the next phase of the process, which would be the simulation and deformation phase. So going off of what we have right now, if you remember back to the beginning of the tutorial, we initially set up our animation skin in conjunction with our rest skin. So using what we have set up here, we can just select our out animation skin, and the next part of the hair or grooming pipeline would be to drop a guide deform. As the mesh moves, this is basically a point deform to move the guides from the static skin to the deforming mesh. So if we jump back into our viewport here for a moment, I'm just going to let this load up, and just disabling our hair generate nodes and having a look at our skin geometry, we need to get the guides to deform across the surface of the animated mesh. Just disabling our eyes there, and that is where the guide deform comes in. So simply, while having our guide deform selected, we will drag our guide groom to the top object and then paste our animated skin in there, in the animated skin parameter. Disabling that for the time being, we can see that the guides deform across the surface of the the animated skin. Simply then retarget your hair generate to your guide deform, and then view your hair gen. As it is a pretty straightforward process, as we can see, the hairs are reacting quite well on the surface of the deforming geometry and sticking to the geometry. Now, this is a bit of a we can see a little bit of a separation in certain parts of the groom, where we've got a little bit of stretching in a few parts, and a little bit of like separation. As you can see, we've got this almost lower resolution underneath. This is somewhat problematic sometimes, and however, this is quite easy to fix actually. The problem being right now is that the skin geometries in relation to each other, there's a bit of a mismatch in attributes and interpolations across the skin. Now this could be a number of different issues, but I find instead of trying to find the specific mismatch in attributes, whether that's on a point normal scale or on a point interpolation variable, or a UV variable that's mismatched, or a point number that's mismatched, the easiest thing we can do is just quickly force it to conform to the correct geometry. So a quick way to do this, in my experience, is just to quickly grab a plane shape node, pop that down, connect it to your match topology, and connect your secondary. What you'll see happens here is that it allows us to force this geometry into this position, and as you can see, it's messing up our UVs, which is kind of a telltale sign that this is kind of what's wrong with the mesh, but not a problem. Simply using a copy attribute, an attribute copy, we can simply grab that and copy the UVs over to the side, which will correct that. Doing so, allowing our hairgen to load, you will see that this has corrected the problem that we've been having. As you can see, the mesh is now, the hair is now scattering correctly across the mesh without the stepping that we had before with the breakup on the actual division lines of the mesh. The next step in the process would be the simulation aspect. As we can see, the guide deform is working correctly, where it places the guides in the correct position and adheres them to an animated mesh. They are sticking, but they're not simulating, so we would of course need to simulate it. Simply drop a guide simulate sub and then drag your guide deform into its parameter. Go back to your first frame, and then you will see that the groom is loaded up. Now, just with the default settings, we're quickly going to press play and just see what our initial parameters on the simulator looks like. As we can see, it's quite loose on the tail. This is not ideal, as a cat's tail has got a bit more body and rigidity to its fall off in form. The rest of the body seems pretty good, but we won't be needing it to be as loose as what it is now. The grooms, when it comes to simulating clumped fur like this, I find it's often better to find yourself on the side to err on the side of restraint, as if you were to watch the actual reference of a moving cat, there's very little in terms of large stroke movements, as in the hair doesn't flow all the way from side to side, understanding the fact that there's constraints between the actual clumps and guides that keep hair retained in its base shape, with more of a movement as a whole than as a single strand is a good way to look at things. We won't go too in depth on the actual simulation of the guides, but instead just a quick overall good settings to get us to an acceptable result for this tutorial. So looking at the guide simulate, just out of a point of interest on its composition as a SOP, what we can look at is the internals. So inside the node here, we've got a series of trees and operations, but I'd like to draw your attention to the right hand side tree here. Zooming in, you'll see there's a DOP network, which is our vellum sim. This is the primary simulation node that is affecting the general simulation, and inside you'll see just a standard DOP network layout for a vellum sim. Its constraints can be found just above it here, and you can add and remove constraints here should you wish to affect the constraints in a more advanced manner. Here we can find its file caches and also the out nodes. In many situations I find that it's quite useful to use these this part of the tree here to affect secondary operations as almost a post process, if you will, whether that is blending back to your base groom or removing areas of the simulation. I find it's easier to do it here than in a what would be a more traditional sense, in a more complex manner. The groom blend node, for example, is a very useful tool in that situation. But that may be a bit more advanced for the needs that we have right now. Just looking at what we have here in the guide sim, if we just match the current definition just to lock it, looking at the parameters available to us here, we can see that most of the DOP network's simulation parameters have been bumped to the top level, where we can access the simulation, the parameters for the vellum solver. One of the first changes we will be doing is bumping up our substeps to about 5. I usually like to use a pretty high substep, especially if it's on a groom that's this light. You just get a much better result in terms of just across the board simulation attributes. Vellum physical, this is the default thickness and the actual physical properties of the vellum per guide. So adjusting thickness would adjust the thickness of the hair. This can be visualized if you enter inside the node tree and then select your DOP network to visualize its guides. Moving forward, we've got the vellum constraints. This is the constraint properties for your guides and how they interact with each other. This is where most of your adjustments will take place. One of the primary things we will do initially is be adjusting the bend stiffness. We'll be bringing that up to about a value of 6 to retain the rigidity in the groom. We'll also be activating the clump constraints, which creates stretch constraints between the different guides. So this guide will actually adhere to the guide next to it in some fashion, and it just adds a little bit of that more realism when it comes to clumps interacting with each other. Vellum forces, this is a simple way to add wind, drag, add a volume force. Say if there was a force inside the hair that would push the hair away from each other. We won't be using any of this at the moment, as it's a very simple scene that we're trying to achieve. Vellum collisions, you have self collisions, which will collide the vellum with itself. This can get pretty heavy in terms of its operational requirements in the simulation, as you have increasingly higher resolution grooms, I find it's often just best to keep this off unless it's absolutely needed, which would be very evident if you see the groom crashing in on itself. But just using the simple changes to the simulation that we have just done, I will be taking us to our camera viewpoint and then running a flipbook. I will run this in a time lapse and then show you the result. As we can see, I just stopped it a bit short here because it's already evident that we have a few issues. As we can see, the general movement is a bit better with its retaining of shape and its rigidity. We may need to turn this down slightly, as I do see a few problems in its constraints up here. But another issue that we can see is here in the front leg, you'll see that the guides are stretching. Now this is a very common problem when it comes to grooming in Houdini, when it comes to general simulations, and these are interpenetration issues. This is something common that can plague bad animation. If you've got, for example, arms that penetrate the body, or the initial guides from their starting position penetrate, you will get this almost stretching effect. The very easy solution to deal with this kind of thing is to ensure that you have something which we like to call pre-roll. The pre-roll is basically the animation. If you have, for example, your shot starts at frame 1, you would have 10 frames prior to that where the animation starts from its rest position, the rest position being the static meshes position. Sometimes you might receive an animation that does not have this rest position or this pre-roll on it, which is something that can be very easily remedied with a similar solution we used to correct the skin attributes to improve the layout of our hair generate. So just as a quick solution to this would be to again go back into our skin geometry, and then simply using a blend shape we can grab our right chain, and then simply using the left chain, and then as you can see this returns it from a rest to a walking position. Using Alt and Control you can place a keyframe on the blend, and with that we will blend over 4 frames to our walking position. Thus we've created a little bit of pre-roll and a bit of a smoother transition to the groom. This will help correct our penetration issues, as now starting position none of the guides are colliding or penetrating with the mesh, and as it falls into its first frame position, the guides that were penetrating will collide with the mesh instead of penetrating it. So going back to our guide simulate, we will just be adjusting our constraints to be just a touch softer, as when you do engage your clump constraints it does add a lot of rigidity to your simulation, so we may need to adjust this even further. I will be running another flipbook. As we can see, now that the flipbook is finished, we've got the pre-roll is effective in its goal of helping the mesh achieve a settle, and then allowing it to smoothly transition to its animation. And as you can see, the problem we had previously where it was stretching on the back and the front legs with strange divisions happening is no longer present, as the guides now collide with the mesh instead of stretching across it. As we can see, the tail is behaving very well, very natural, and I think this is a good stopping point for us in terms of a simulation, just to keep things simple for the sake of this tutorial as an introduction. The next part would be simply to retarget our hair gen to use our guides simulate as its target position. and then simply enabling that, we can see that the hair is working correctly on the surface of the mesh and adhering to the simulated guides. And just before we finish, the last thing to do would be to just drop a guide deform onto the whiskers. So simply using the same setup we had here, you could even duplicate the guide deform that we have present here. Simply after retargeting the guide deform, we can then retarget the hair gen to use the guide deform. And then as we can see, the hair gen follows the mesh. You could put a simulate on the whiskers if you wanted to, for a little bit of bounce, but for the sake of this tutorial, I think we can just call this finished. As we can see here, this is essentially the final product that we have achieved. So I'd just like to point out that to render this, simply enable your guide simulate and your guide grooms as the base meshes. If you wish to render in this fashion, you can also then just cache out your guide simulate. But if you wish to render in a more controlled file cache manner, simply create a geo node and grab the final outputs from your hairs, and then paste them into 2 object merges, and then run a file cache underneath them. Using that node, you can render your curves as a subdivision found here in your geometry tab. Simply enable render curves as subdivision mantra in your file cache and assign your materials accordingly. I would just like to thank you again for watching this tutorial, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me on the email that can be found at the end of this tutorial with any technical questions you might have. This has been the introduction to Houdini grooming in Houdini19. Thank you so much.